Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we're here to talk about serial queens of the silent era, which is the most common way to refer to these female pioneers of the film industry who also were a clear precedent to the more contemporary female action film heroes. These were women who rose to fame in the early to mid 1910s and eventually disappeared from the screens by again early to mid 1920s. So the time frame when they were active and most influential was relatively short, but still I think really remarkable. The women that I'm going to talk about in today's video sadly were most likely women you haven't heard of or briefly mentioned, if at all. So in today's video I wanted to explore these pioneer women and also give a little bit of context for how they emerged into popularity and why again they eventually disappeared from the screen. It will be also a case to mention or to explore a little bit serial films, the advent of serial films. This is a topic that I find as a film viewer and also as a woman particularly interesting and revealing, and I hope you do too. I wanted to, before I start with the video, thank the Women Film Pioneer Project for giving me superb recommendations to learn from when I asked about this particular topic. Needless to say that I highly encourage you to go to their website if you're also interested in this topic and in other topics regarding female pioneers such as the ones we will talk about in today's video. So first of all, what were serial films? They were some of the earliest forms of film that were especially prominent and popular during the first half of the 20th century. They were especially popular during the silent era in the immediate years preceding World War I, but they also came into great popularity in the 30s. But it was in the 40s and the 50s when, also with the rise of television, they started to lose popularity and eventually they stopped being produced. But in more than one way, they have a lot in common with TV series because serial films were episodic, usually shown over a period of weeks up to several years, and thus they were played very often, every week or every 2 weeks, sometimes as well, in installments with a longer feature. I have also read that in most cases those serial films would also be accompanied by a marketing strategy or promotion strategy that would also include a fascicle for each episode that audiences could buy with magazines at the time. So there was a whole business behind these serial films, also in many ways a precedent to other strategies that we're still seeing nowadays. Over time, besides their influence on television, they have also had a very important influence in movies, in cinema as well, most evidently in creating epic serialized installments of movies or multi-pack stories with prequels, sequels, and so on, like we've seen with film franchises such as Star Wars, The Matrix, Indiana Jones, but we are still definitely seeing the remnants of that with other film franchises. So as you can see, even though serial films as such, they eventually disappeared, their impact and their influence in the way that fiction is consumed are very high. But of course, serialized fiction was not something that cinema came up with, for it had long been going on in the literary world. Its popularity increased, especially during Victorian era, as most novels around that time, they first appeared as installments in weekly or monthly publications. So we are talking here again about a format, about a way to conceive and distribute fiction that has again a really long history. In the case of cinema, as a relatively new medium at the beginning of the 20th century, the first serial films that were produced, they often had a very simplistic plot with recurring elements and the suspenseful cliffhanger ending so that viewers would return dying to know what happened to the protagonist. What is very remarkable useful and important to know is that in those early days, especially during the 1910s, the serial films featuring female action heroes were by far the most popular ones, which in turn coincided with a very, even though short, but very prominent period for women that one of the books that I really based my research on establishes from roughly 1908 till 1916, which I quote was the most promising moment for women of American film history. Those days, there was a significant number of women that were in the film industry. They were seeking equal parts profit, acknowledgement, and control over their work, and we're still at that nowadays. Names such as Alice Guy Blaché or Lois Weber made such a great impact, and yet they remained somewhat obscure figures for a very long time. And sadly, the same thing happened to many of the silent serial queens that we will be talking about today. In the early 20th century, serial films became a box office success and a popular and a cultural sensation in which women were at the center of it, and in most cases were also in control not only of the roles they played on the screen but also off screen, directing, writing, and producing. What's important to understand is that women from this era were offering a very tangible example of the new woman concept that had emerged in the late 19th century. This was also coinciding with the suffragette movement, changing social roles and changing social expectations. So who were the serial queens I'm talking about? In most cases, they would go to all sorts of perils and adventures and tribulations, sometimes needing help, but in most cases, saving herself from danger. So these movies contributed to an alternate vision of how women were depicted on screen. Also, particularly shorter feature films were the realm for innovation and for more transgressive experimentation, which is something that we saw in my recent video discussing Buster Keaton films. Although discussing women in comedy and slapstick those days as well could be a whole other topic for a video, I will focus, as I said from the beginning, in this action-packed serial films. And so I'll begin by discussing some of the early examples of the female-led serial films, Mary Fuller and Kathlyn Williams. Mary Fuller particularly appeared in 1912 in what's considered the first movie serial named What Happened to Mary, produced by Edison Studios. It was a series of 12 monthly one-reel episodes, meaning that they lasted about 10 minutes. Each chapter was a complete unit in itself, with a story that would start and resolve by the end of the film. That made Mary Fuller very popular those days. And as I was saying before, in addition to the films, there were regular magazine installments that people could get. Mary Fuller was in many instances also a paradigmatic case in the sense that she started her acting career really young, working on the stage first and then transitioning into films, but her career practically was through by 1917, which is a circumstance that you'll see me repeating sadly when I mention other film pioneers of the serial film. It is also important to know that some of these serials were not shot in Hollywood, but in New York or New Jersey, where the decentralization of the motion picture business became a model. In 1913, Kathlyn Williams starred in the 13-episode serial called The Adventures of Kathlyn, which is claimed to be the one using the cliffhanger format for the first time, with each episode being open-ended and having the emblematic to be continued at the end of each installment. This made this Kathlyn serial a super hit and also a model to follow. It was released by the Selig Polyscope company. This is considered to be, though, a lost serial. In Kathlyn's case, even though her career spanned a little bit longer up to the 1930s, it still waned down considerably. And even though in Kathlyn's case her career extended a little bit longer up to the early 1930s, still her longer feature films could never match the success that she got with the adventures of Kathlyn. And then we move on to Pearl White, the serial queen that is considered the most emblematic reference of the silent serial queen's grace. She was at the height of her fame in 1914, and she was probably, again as I read, the most famous woman in the world those days, not just in America, but in the world. With the emblematic, again, The Perils of Pauline. In that serial, Pearl White displayed these other, more independent qualities and also traits traditionally associated with men, with the background of modern technology, and also, much like Buster Keaton, having to play around with trains, automobiles. She followed up the Perils success with another smash called The Exploits of Elaine, a serial that was exported to France under the title The Mysteries of New York in French, and it was followed up with 2 sequels called The New Exploits of Elaine and The Romance of Elaine. And fun fact, if you've watched the TV series Friends, because in the apartment that Joey and Chandler shared, there was a poster of precisely The Mysteries of New York, the whole series. So you can see how far the impact has gone. That is a more contemporary impact. The influence of the serials starring Pearl White was immense in her time, and on the subsequent decades, there was a pre-code serial remake of The Perils of Pauline and starring Evelyn Knapp, who became those days a leading actress of B-movie serials in the 30s. In 1947, there was a movie released as The Perils of Pauline starring Betty Hutton as Pearl White. It was sort of a musical biopic of Pearl White's story. And also in 1967, there was a comedy released called The Perils of Pauline, starring Pamela Austin and Pat Boone. It was intended to be a TV series, but it didn't work out, and they released it as a whole film. So you can see how impactful these female-led serials were, especially in the case of Pearl White. More than enough evidence of her tremendous impact. 2 other very important serial queens were Helen Holmes and Helen Gibson. They both starred in a serial called The Hazards of Helen, produced then by the KLM Company, which ran between the end of 1914 and the early 1917. It is believed to be the longest of the film serial format, and one that was definitely conceived as more of a series than as a succession of cliffhanger episodes. Helen Holmes was a silent film actress, producer, director, screenwriter, and stunt woman and box office draw in the 1910s. Helen Holmes, much like Helen Gibson, is primarily known also for the most part, performing her own stunts, and she is also very much associated with trains and with her railroad adventures. I believe she was called the Railroad Girl, and as I said before, she became famous and her serials became famous for her finding really clever ways to single-handedly solve any situation. When she was at the height of her popularity, she started her own production company with her husband, forming together Signal Film Productions, intending to make their own adventure films. But eventually financial and distribution problems ended their production partnership. Helen not only acted, but she also wrote some of the episodes and directed some as well. Still, Helen again created another great sensation, much like Pearl White, but in any case, as I said before, and as in most cases, eventually, again, by mid-1920s, her career had taken a different turn. I also wanted to mention Helen Gibson because she took over in the serial The Hazards of Helen after Helen Holmes left to form her own company. And she had previously appeared in the serial being the stunt for Helen Holmes in different episodes. Even though, as I said before, Helen Holmes performed most of her stunts, Helen Gibson was also another remarkable woman. She was a film actress, a producer, a rodeo performer, and is also considered the first American professional stunt woman. And she had, I believe, like many of these women, a very remarkable and very interesting life in a career that in her case spanned over 50 years in films. And by 1930, she became Hollywood's first professional stunt woman, as I was saying before. tour for many major studios until her retirement in 1962. And the last two serial queens that I wanted to mention in today's video were Ruth Roland and Grace Cunard. In the case of Ruth Roland, she was a stage and film actress and eventually a film producer as well. She started her career working for Calum. Ruth had her first major success with a serial called The Red Circle, in which she was a woman with a strange birthmark or mark on her hand, and she became also a sensation. That was 1915, and sadly this serial is also considered to be a lost one. And she eventually also established her own production company called Ruth Roland Serials, creating serials such as The Adventures of Ruth, also another lost serial. And again, much like in the case of other actresses I've been mentioning, by mid-1920s she retired, although in her case, because she was a very good businesswoman, she had amassed quite a fortune. Also, fun fact for those of you who don't know, Ruth Roland is also in a way responsible for the name that Mexican actor Gilbert Roland took when he came to Hollywood with the combination of his two favorite actors of the time, John Gilbert and Ruth Roland. And lastly, Grace Cunard also followed yet again a very similar path, starting again very early in the theater and then transition into films. In her case though, she started in films and serials that she also wrote or co-wrote, even edited and directed. She formed a creative partnership with Francis Ford, John Ford's elder brother, appearing with him in the 1910s in shorts that became again very popular, eventually also being nicknamed as the serial queen. But then again, as they were approaching the 1920s, her career suffered, and so she began appearing in mostly B pictures, a few new serials in the 30s, mostly uncredited, until she retired in the early 1940s. And even though again there were other serial queens, I feel that the ones I've covered in today's video are the most prominent. I really almost feel that I've barely scratched the surface of what these incredible women accomplished and why they paved the way for a new representation of women in cinema in the United States. So what is left for me to cover, I feel, is why they in fact eventually disappeared. For what I could gather, what happened was an accumulation of circumstances. On the one hand, as times evolved, especially by the end of World War I, these productions, these serials, were mostly relegated, as I have read, to children's matinees, and subsequently one of the main targets for the rising new wave of censorship. Also, as the film industry was evolving, these censorship advocates began gaining more and more support, which parts of society linked to an increase in juvenile crime, and thus morale, decency, and censorship directly targeted serial, especially action serials, and the ones depicting women in these circumstances and were seen in this whole new image was eventually too much for certain sectors of the society. Then something similar happened to slapstick comedy and the role of women in comedy as well. But in the case of action serials, crime was definitely seen as pernicious, so certainly one of the first to be targeted, and that was practically the end of this type of female-led serial films. Then also at the start of the 1920s, there were several scandals in Hollywood that really prompted eventually the self-censorship that came to be the production code, the Hays Code. And then there was a major decrease in movie attendance, which studios and producers at the time attributed to all those scandals. And by the late also 1920s and early 1930s, the serial films that were produced had male leads, and Buster Graves' Flash Gordon was perhaps the most famous serial of the time. So that is, on general terms, what prompted the disappearance of serial queens, but there is a lot more to unpack here that I cannot possibly discuss in a single video. But I'm going to end the video here as natural light has practically gone, and I will start working now on the next video on film noir.
We'll all have some fun together.
I've posted a poll on the community section of the channel. So thank you so much for everyone who voted. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Thank you so much for your love of classic movies. And as always, stay safe, take care. Thank you so much, and see you all soon in my next video. Bye!